welcome to the launch of the IISS Armed Conflict Survey, which I hold up before me and which you should all have got a copy of for those of you in the room. For those of you joining us live online, we're gathered here today in the run-up to the launch of the 18th IISS Manama Dialogue, which begins in a few hours' time here in Manama in Bahrain. And as a prelude to that, I have gathered an all-star panel to discuss the launch of the Armed Conflict Survey, one of the IISS's flagship annual publications. This launch is going to run for about 1 hour. You'll hear presentations from Irene Mia, who's the editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, and then a number of our other colleagues, and then we shall open up for a period of Q&A and discussion with the audience. My name is James Crabtree. I'm the Executive Director of the IISS office in Singapore, IISS Asia, and I'm going to keep my remarks as brief as I possibly can and begin by handing straight over to Irene Mia.
Thanks, James. Good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to people online. It's great to be here. It's actually the culmination of a year work for this very big report. As James mentioned, the ACS is one of the Institute's flagship publications, which is monitoring and trying to make sense of the conflict landscape since the inception of the series in 2015. We currently cover 33 active conflicts across the world, so across all the region of the world, including the Middle East, of course. We try to provide really our audience of expert practitioners, policymakers, and corporates with some strategic and forward-looking assessment of drivers, implication, and also outlook for conflicts across the world. We have a double filter to look at conflict, to understand conflict. So we look at the domestic drivers of conflict as well as dynamics, including a focus on non-state armed group that, as we know, are an increasingly important player and driver of violence across the world. But also in line with the IISS global and strategic research focus, we adopt a geopolitical lens to the study of conflict. So we try to look to map the geopolitical drivers of conflict, but also their interlinkages across the region and across the world, and their global repercussions. So just to highlight two features of this year report, we are also including selected strategic regional essay on trends which are of strategic importance for the regions, including de-escalation in the Middle East, geopolitical dimension of conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa, the regional repercussion of the Russia-Ukraine war in Eurasia, also geopolitics of synthetic drugs in the Americas, and also China involvement in Asia conflict. And some of those topics my colleague will cover in more details. We also have a special feature on climate security this year in view of the increased urgency to understand the complex nexus between conflict, climate vulnerability, and global security. Another thing I wanted to mention is that we are strong believer of the power of data to bring conflict trends into life, and also to inform our qualitative assessment, which is obviously quite important as well. So the report is very rich. You will see if you get a copy. It's very rich in data, in maps, in tables, and infographics. We have key statistics on all type of conflict related events. We also have visual timelines of key political and military events for each conflict. What I wanted to highlight in this context is this Armed Conflict Global Relevance Indicator, which is a proprietary composite indicators, which really embodies our filter to conflict. So we kind of assess the global importance of conflict based on their geopolitical impact, but also human impact and intensity. So we use that as a way to complement our qualitative assessment and also to prioritize analysis. A couple of words on the special features this year, which is going to be on climate security. And of course, what we try to do is really try to explore and kind of make sense of the complex interlinkages between climate change, conflict, and global security. We have 3 chapters in the report this year, which are on 3 topics which selected for their strategic importance in terms of shaping the current and future conflict landscape at the internal as well as geopolitical levels. So we are looking at the nexus between peace building and climate resilience, and this is very important considering then 60% of the 10 top climate vulnerable countries are actually affected by conflict. So there is a very important need to really have the 2 happening at the same time, and Benjamin will say a bit more on this. Also, we are looking at, again, going back to the importance of non-state armed group as one of the, I would say, part of the problem, but also part of the solution. We're looking at their role in terms of weaponizing natural resources in conflict, but also after conflict as a tool of legitimacy. And thirdly, on a more geopolitical level, we're looking at the geostrategic implication of climate mitigation and energy transition, including in terms of geopolitical competition for control of critical minerals, which are going to be important for the clean energy transition. Just a couple of words on the main findings of the report, which I will share also with Benjamin, who has been a key part of the team, of the core team putting together the report. So the first trends I would highlight is really the fact that geopolitics is again a key driver of conflict. What we have seen is that even if the majority of conflict at the moment are internal, an increasing number is internationalized. We have seen an increase in third-party intervention in the last 10 years. They have tripled since in the last 10 years. So we had seen this kind of really increasing importance of geopolitical drivers because those third parties are actually intervening in pursuit of their strategic interest and geopolitical interest. Of course, the Ukraine war has escalated this growing trend to a new level. As we know, it's also an interstate conflict, but there are other interstate tensions that are brewing up in the world, including the one between China and the US over Taiwan. The other related trends to that is the fact that we have seen a reversal in a trend which we had seen in the last 10 years or so of progressive disengagement of the West in conflict. What we've seen is that the Russia-Ukraine war, by threatening security in Europe and international rule-based order, has really strengthened the West cohesion. And this is something which is going to very likely reshape the global conflict landscape, and also is going to have implication on many ongoing civil wars in the Middle East, notably. And the third element related to climate change as well is really climate change as a next frontier or already current frontier of geopolitical tensions. We are seeing that disagreement over mitigation responsibility as well as competition over critical resources is increasingly changing the geopolitical equilibrium and also is an important source of interstate tension, but also is something that is going to be more and more a factor in non-state armed group strategies in internal conflict in resource-rich, fragile countries. In fact, as you see, you cannot really see the graphic I have there, but it's really where the critical resources are. And as you can see, most of the critical resources are in developing countries and in fragile countries. So this is something which is going to really shape, again, the global conflict landscape. And it's also something that could be a game changer for many of those countries if they're able to leverage really the potential of those critical minerals. And thirdly, very quickly, the Russia-Ukraine war wider implications. What we have seen is that obviously the Russia-Ukraine conflict is yet another global shock building on the coronavirus pandemic, but also the long-standing accelerating climate emergency to really exacerbate drivers of conflict globally. Disruption in global supply chains and spikes in energy and food prices has hit several developing countries very hard. And it intensified pre-existing food insecurity and high inflation trends. What we're seeing is really an unprecedented food insecurity across the world, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and in other regions. This is also will create, unfortunately, fertile ground for instability and social unrest. And also, the other element about obviously the crisis in Ukraine is that the unprecedented humanitarian crisis and reconstruction needs created by the war will also limit international aid and development funding available for other conflicts across the world, which, as we know, are many. So, unfortunately, with this not so positive assessment, I will give the floor to Benjamin for some other key findings for the report.
Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be here and to present this year-long work on the margin of the Manama dialogue. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the features of armed conflicts in 2021 with an eye also at trends in the last decade or so. And I have 3 key messages for you. The first one is around the number and the scale of armed conflicts. And as you can see from this graph, in the last few years, we have reached a peak in the number of armed conflicts globally since World War II. And this has been an ongoing trend since 2011, since the Arab Spring in 2011. We recorded in 2021 54 armed conflicts globally. You see also the line that spikes as well in 2011, which is the conflicts between the non-state armed groups, so where the state is not part of it. And this obviously speaks to the proliferation of non-state armed groups. In terms of trends, we see that what accounts for the increase in armed conflicts globally is the civil wars with external interventions. And here I turn to my second key message. What are the civil wars with external interventions? Are civil wars where an external party, an external state party, directly militarily intervenes. And this, looking at the trends, so we're looking at the blue conflicts are these civil wars that from 2011, 2012 have spiked. And we arrived today to a situation where we have as many civil wars with no external intervention and civil wars with external intervention. So this is one of the most remarkable trends in the last few years. Obviously, this trend reflects the current global disorder and the current geopolitical competition between great powers. Now, who are these external interveners? We have the usual. We have great powers, but we increasingly have middle powers and regional powers in different regions. Now, we have seen this phase of external countries intervening in civil wars during the Cold War, the proxy wars, where the US would support one party, the Soviet Union would support a second party, and there would be a proxy war. Now, today, obviously, that resembles this situation, but it's way more complex because there are many more state actors intervening. The Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, which I will speak about in a few minutes, are the 2 regions that mostly have these trends. So moving to my third message, what are the consequences on conflicts? The conflicts today are more and more protracted. They are longer in length. They last longer. And this protractedness is underpinned by different factors, and one of which is the intervention by external powers, but also by the proliferation of these different non-state armed groups, paramilitary militias, rebel groups, the connection between criminal groups and rebel groups. So there are dynamics that make conflicts more intractable as we define them. And so a set of let's say, of policy implications. So if conflicts are more protracted, one reason is that there is less and less appetite for conflict resolution. There has been, in the last decade, a demise of the norms for conflict resolution and a weakened international system to arrive at a resolution. We see more and more the UN Security Council being sort of like blocked into solving some of these conflicts. And we have seen a cooperation in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War when actually was a very flourishing moment for conflict resolutions. The second point is that the interventions to address conflict have grown in scope and scale in the last decade or so. We have more peacekeeping operations, we have more stabilization operations, we have counterterrorism operations, we have development interventions that try to help with mitigating the effect of armed conflicts and humanitarian aid as well. Now, there is a lot of I would call strategic unclarity between all of these operations, even though they should work and they do work in synergy. The objectives are still, and the objectives and the mandate are still diverse. And the third point, which speaks to our set of essays on climate security, is that climate vulnerabilities and conflict risks very often share the same drivers. And so those are, that calls for a much more coherent agenda and a nexus between these two topics. I'll turn to Emile, and we will now have a more like regionally focused presentations.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all. So who would have thought that the Middle East would see relative stability and de-escalation in the past 12 to 18 months? So I'm going to try to offer some context and explanation of the drivers that led to that. In fact, looking at numbers, casualties, displacement, etc., relatively speaking, the main conflicts in the MENA region have been less intense in the past year plus. We have seen de-escalation in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, the conflict that one would describe as civil wars with external intervention. And often this de-escalation on the ground has happened in parallel with regional de-escalation among the major regional powers, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi, the UAE. Now, while all this is welcome, it's important to assess properly what has happened and the potential of these ceasefires, these lulls, into turning into something more sustainable. These ceasefires have been primarily motivated by military stalemates in those countries, largely and also military fatigue among the various local warring sides. But also because of fatigue, frustration, and changing priorities among their major regional backers. So the pandemic has really helped some of the major players in the region think about how much they wanted to invest in those competitions. But they also looked at the battlefield and they asked themselves, to what extent can we really shape it? Can we win? We can perhaps have a position on those battlefields to be there if there is a potential for a settlement. But can anyone really win in Syria or Libya or Yemen? I think that's a fundamental change in mindset from where we were a decade ago. So that point to the limitations of these stalemates and ceasefire to turn into sustainable de-escalation, détente, and prospect for political settlement. What we haven't seen is in Yemen, Syria, and Libya, these lulls turning into or adding momentum to, for instance, UN-driven processes. There were attempts, and we certainly should be grateful that UN special envoys and others and diplomats in the region and so on have tried. But in no place have we seen a real breakthrough, something that could lead to a sustainable outcome. If anything, we've seen, and I'll develop it in a second, the failure of UN processes to deliver something that would constrain the armed factions and transfer power to more political leaders. In part, that's because regional and international powers, once they reach a ceasefire or they decide to de-escalate, basically hand the difficult mission to the UN without necessarily the leverage and the muscle, and without the local parties being really committed to that. They often see those ceasefires as an opportunity to regroup, rethink their military objectives, and wait until new opportunities for military conquest arise. Like looking in a bit more in more detail, look at Syria, for instance. The battle lines have largely stayed the same for the past year and a half. But right now, we're looking at the following questions. Will Turkey launch a new military intervention in the northeast? That looks more likely these days. We see greater instability in southern Syria, in part because the agreement in 2018 to stabilize northern Syria was never very solid, was not very really implemented. There was no real attempt at reconciliation and stabilization. And we see new forms of instability rising, most importantly, the narcotics trade from Syria into Jordan and then the rest of the Gulf. There's also a big question right now, the extent to which the US presence in Syria and Iraq is sustainable, and whether, if there is a change in that presence, that would lead to a revival of ISIS, for instance, perhaps not as the monster we saw in the previous decade, perhaps in a weakened form, but still as a potent challenger, because it continues to exist in the Badia Desert in Syria. In parallel, the political track is almost non-existent at the moment in Syria. The UN track is peripheral, it's marginal. They barely meet. When they meet, there is no agreement. The UN special envoy is trying, but that must be the most frustrating job in the world at the moment. The Astana format, which brought together Russia, Iran, and Turkey, today is very fluid. Why? Because there is a change in power dynamics within that format. Russia is today mirrored in a conflict in Ukraine, which means that, relatively speaking, Turkey is a more powerful state, and Iran has greater space to operate in Syria. This is an unstable equilibrium. Also importantly, the move towards regional normalization with the Assad government are here, but they don't seem to be a solution in terms of stabilization, political settlement, and so on. So this is a major conflict at the door of many Middle Eastern states, southern flank of Europe, and so on. And there's no sign that it is coming to an end. Yemen is another example. I think this year has been the least violent year in Yemen since 2014, when the Houthis took over Sana'a and then in 2015 started spreading. But just before that, early 2022, was one of the most intense moments of fighting in Yemen, because the Houthis had become very ambitious and wanted to take the central city of Ma'arib, which is really the last government holdout in this place. It is precisely because there was a massive fight for Ma'arib that the Houthis failed to win, that essentially that they've agreed to a ceasefire. That is also due to Saudi fatigue. They were willing to defend Ma'arib, but they're no longer willing to take the fight deep into Houthi territory, at least not at the moment. And also because the UN saw a window of tactical opportunity here, and it did a relatively good job. The problem is that in those 6 months, the Houthis in particular, but also others, have essentially prepared themselves for the next round of fighting. It may not be as intense, it may not be as nationwide, but it is certainly no formula for a political settlement. I'll end by saying that Libya is a good example of what happens when there is no political muscle, no real international, regional commitment towards a political solution. 2021 was the year of de-escalation in Libya, but it ended on a very sour note when the elections were not held, and that led again to a divided government. And what we saw in 2022 was less violence in Libya, but still real attempts at taking power here and there. What we're dealing with in Libya, however, are weakened actors who cannot do what happened in 2019, 2020. But who knows, those weak actors can weaken even further, and then other actors could replace them with more ambition, more resources, and perhaps more external support. So the Middle East, we should be careful about being complacent when it comes to that. Obviously, the big fight these days is in Europe, but the potential for renewed large-scale violence in the Middle East is still there. Thank you.
I'll talk about the trends in sub-Saharan Africa. And in this region, the three key messages that I had earlier apply squarely to sub-Saharan Africa in terms of like the scale of conflict, the internationalization of those civil wars, and the protractedness of conflict. Conflicts in Africa, they skyrocketed around 2014. It is still the most conflict-affected region now in 2022. It has the highest number of fragile countries according to the World Bank and OECD. And in our armed conflict survey, there are 16 countries examined in the report. In the last 2 years, the region went through several military overthrows, especially in the in West Africa and the Sahel. And also, we need to mention the rise of even more like the rise of terrorist and Islamist groups. By some measures, half of the Islamist terrorist incidents of the last 12 months have taken place in sub-Saharan Africa. There are also two other trends that I want to mention that go hand in hand and in parallel with the rise of conflict. One is about the one that is climate change and the rise of extreme weather events. In terms of especially the alteration of patterns of rains, with more and more floods, with droughts like in the Horn of Africa, or floods like in South Sudan. So we see a pattern of economic disruption, economic and social disruption, that is a further enabler of armed conflict. And the second parallel trend is the resulting humanitarian impact from the conflict, from all the conflicts. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are today 137 million food insecure people, which is a number that is tripled has tripled since 2018. Obviously, conflict accounts for that, but also the displacement from climate change and from COVID and the different compounding crises. 8 of the top 10 African countries that experience food insecurity are facing conflict. So we see food insecurity and armed conflict that really go in parallel. Now, the areas of crisis in this region, I mean, there is like a continuous arc of insecurity that goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. And we have these regional clusters of conflict in the Sahel, in the Lake Chad Basin, in the Great Lakes region around the Democratic Republic of Congo. and in the Horn of Africa with the civil war in Ethiopia that is sort of the fulcrum of insecurity. Now, that civil war has had a very recent peace agreement, and we will see if that will be able to hold. What I want to mention is the overlapping dimension between all these conflicts. Most of these conflicts have a local dimensions. They start from in peripheral regions where where central government does not have a reach in terms of providing services. There are local grievances and there are identity-based conflicts. These are all sort of textbook cases that we know about. There is like a national dimension to many of these conflicts in terms of a crisis of legitimacy, a broken social contract. We see this in many of the Sahel countries, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, but also in Central African Republic, in South Sudan. There are, as I mentioned earlier, regional dimensions. There are increasingly interstate rivalries that we see in the Great Lakes region. There are rise of tensions and almost on the verge of conflict between the DRC and Rwanda. And there are transnational also elements in which terrorist groups, Islamist extremist groups, have penetrated many of the local grievances. And so there is a factual overlap between these conflicts. And then to conclude with the internationalization of many of these civil wars, and that's where then the geopolitical elements and the war, the Russia-Ukraine war, plays a role in this, where Russia is slowly and swiftly penetrating and strengthening alliances with several countries in the region. And so we have a reflection of the geopolitical competition on the continent in countries like Mali, Central African Republic, and Sudan. So this arc of insecurity has several dimensions, and these conflicts are very multifaceted. So they need multilateral responses, national solutions, and also very local responses. I'll stop there and I'll turn it to Nigel.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Good afternoon, everyone. At the launch of the Armed Conflict Survey a year ago, I offered the view that although we are approaching the 30th anniversary of the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was, nonetheless, no sense in which that region had become stable and peaceful. On the contrary, we can think of the breakup of the Soviet Union as a great geopolitical Big Bang, an explosion that sent hot, molten pieces of geopolitical matter, 15 of them, hurling out into the universe. And yet, 30 years on, they had not yet cooled and stabilized and formed an orderly solar system, as it were. Sadly, that prediction has been amply borne out by the events of the past year, which have been exceptionally turbulent for what, again, 30 years on, we still somehow call the post-Soviet state. There have been many examples of tensions and conflict within states and between states. And let me say something about three of the most important, which all, in slightly different ways, illustrate this point about the lack of stability and settledness after that great geopolitical Big Bang. The first, in the lower right part of the screen here, was the rumbling tensions between two Central Asian states, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which have flared up, caused dozens of deaths. And one of the most important reasons for this is that the border between them remains undemarcated. And this is part of a larger theme in the region. Borders which had been intra-state borders, separating Soviet republics in Soviet times, then became, after the geopolitical Big Bang, interstate borders. Yet many of them are still not properly recognized by those states that are separated by them. And that remains a problem. The second is the conflict in the middle of the map there between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The origins of this conflict lie even further back. In late Soviet times, it was the first big conflict of that time to flare up in 1988. Again, it's ethnic in nature. It concerns inherited borders, in this case, centering on the Armenian ethnic enclave within Azerbaijan. And although the two countries fought what we now call the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020, that ended with a peace settlement, that ended with a ceasefire, but not a peace settlement. That has flared up again. And even in the past few months, we've seen escalations of that through incursions by Azerbaijani forces onto Armenian territory proper, an alarming escalation of that conflict that, again, remains emphatically unresolved. But, of course, the third and most significant conflict in this region, indeed the defining conflict of this year, is Russia's war in Ukraine. And this, more than anything, reflects the refusal, in this case by Russia, to accept the verdict of 1991. It is, I would argue, a conflict that is qualitatively different from any other besetting the world at this point. It is the biggest war in Europe since 1945, certainly eclipses anything that happened in the Balkans in the 1990s, terrible though those wars were. Another way of thinking about it, it's the third major power conflict in Europe for a century, following the First World War and the Second World War. Now, Western countries are not yet fighting directly in this war, but they are assuredly participants in it, both in their support for Ukraine through military help and other forms of help, and also in the imposition of sanctions against Russia. And this reminds us that this is a war being fought, and that will be resolved on two fronts. The first is on the battlefield by the military forces of Russia and Ukraine, and the second way it's being fought is on the home fronts of all the respective participants. And that is being conducted mostly by economic means. And I'll come back and say something about the economic dimension in a moment, because it's of global significance. And at this stage, and just to draw upon a remark that Irene made earlier, I think that everyone has been surprised, not least Vladimir Putin, by 9 months into this war, the unity and cohesion that the West, with major Asian partners, has demonstrated across national policies, across societies, and also, most remarkably and unprecedentedly, across substantial parts of the Western private sector that have not merely complied with state sanctions, but have voluntarily amplified them through unforced withdrawals of business relationships with Russia. That's an absolutely unprecedented development. It sets an interesting precedent for the future. Now, this war has already borne many of the bitter fruits of any terrible conflict. Over 200,000 people either killed or injured in this war, hundreds of billions of dollars of economic damage, over 6 million Ukrainians that have been displaced within the country, and another over 6 million that have been forced to flee overseas. But I think it's very, very important, in particular here, to emphasize the fact that this is a conflict of global and not merely regional significance. And that's for at least 3 reasons. And we can talk about these reasons being 3 Ps. And the first is the P of principles. Now, this war and its implications have profound consequences for the fundamental principles of international order, of state sovereignty and the inviolability of borders. That was true of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which was globally important for the same reasons. So what is going on, what's at stake in Europe now, has much larger implications for international order. The second P is prices, commodity prices, in particular oil and food, both of which have been affected, have raised as a consequence of this war so far. Now, that's good for some countries, the oil exporters. It's bad for the food importers. And that will, in turn, impose strains and possibly exacerbate conflicts in other parts of the world. The third P is policies. This war is a catalyst that is driving rapid innovation in policy thinking and practice, in particular about the use of economic weapons of statecraft. Many new forms of sanctions are being honed and applied, and they, incidentally, include sanctions relating to the energy sector. So the date, I'm sure, already in all your diaries, the 5th of December, that is when the EU's near total oil embargo on Russia and the G7 price cap on Russian oil come into force. That's an extraordinary precedent that has much broader implications, it seems to me. And on policies, looking ahead to the future, there is always the possibility that this war will escalate in various ways which have even more direct global impacts. It's a war unlikely to end very soon. And in conclusion, then, if we're thinking ahead to the longer-term implications of its conduct and its outcome, whatever that is, again, 3 Ps. The first is power. What consequences will this have for the balance of power? I'd offer the thought, I think not already significantly appreciated, that this war has already shown the underlying weaknesses and limitations of Russian power across many domains, not only military power, but informational power and cyber power as well. The second is that this war, as it moves on, will shape perceptions of resolve and commitment in ways that have much larger implications, because in diplomacy, everyone is always watching everyone else. And finally, the third P, this war and its outcome will set precedents for the ways that aggression works and is responded to, and again, the conclusions that everyone watching this will draw for that, including for conflicts in other parts of the world. I'll just finally finish, if I may, with an advertisement for the launch of another publication, the one that I edit. Another date for your day. It's the same date, actually, also the 5th of December, when we launch that, and that will explore the geopolitical dimensions of this and other recent events in the world in detail as well. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Nigel, and to the rest of the panelists. So comprehensive though the armed conflict survey is, it doesn't actually cover the entire waterfront of work being done by the IISS. So Nigel's advertisement for his publication is well taken. And before we open up for questions for the remaining 15 minutes, we wanted just to give one more small piece of product placement for another excellent piece of IISS work that was launched this year from our Asian operation. And for that, I'm going to hand briefly over to our colleague, Erin Connolly, to talk about the conflict in Myanmar.
Thanks, James. And I should mention that there is actually an excellent chapter on Myanmar in the Armed Conflict Survey, which you can review after this event. But we have gone beyond that to produce this digital interactive on the conflict in Myanmar. This is a static image, but If you go to the website, myanmar.iiss.org, you can manipulate these different variables to try and understand better what is a very complex conflict. But if I can just briefly touch upon what this image shows, we are all used to seeing conflict around the periphery of Myanmar between ethnic armed organizations and the central government. That's been going on in some cases for 7 decades. What we have seen since the coup d'etat that took place on February 1st, 2021, is, for the first time since the 1940s, armed revolt in the center of Myanmar by Bamar Buddhists against the central government. And that is really unprecedented since the 1940s. And so both sides are seeking dominance over the other. The central government, I should say the junta government, the State Administrative Council, has sought to diminish the intensity and the tempo of the revolt by primarily through use of airstrikes and militias. These airstrikes are not really targeting forces, they're targeting population centers, trying to create refugee crises, internal displacement that would make it more difficult for rebels to live off the land and live off the population. And then we still have, around the periphery of the country, armed conflict going on in most of the major ethnic states, including now, as of August, in Rakhine State. And many of you will remember this is the state where in 2017 and 2018 we saw such violence against the Rohingya population. They're being caught in the crossfire of the current conflict. And the tactics that were used against them in 2018 are now being used against Bamar Buddhists in the center of the country. So that's the situation in Myanmar. I'm happy to take questions on that alongside colleagues afterwards if there are any.
Very good. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, everybody. So we now have a period for about 15 minutes of questions. We're going to end at the top of the hour. That's 5 o'clock here in Manama. Maybe a different time for those of you watching at home. I see a question at the front. Maybe if you might introduce yourself and a microphone will be whisked to you as you can ask your question.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Bari Alamuddin. I'm a delegate in the conference. I'm a writer and journalist. And my question is to Emil. Thank you, Emil, for a very interesting take on the situation of all the conflicts. However, I would have liked to hear from you about what's happening in Iran. It started with a protest. It seems to be moving into more of an uprising and conflict. And I would like to know what you read. What would this criminal regime do to its population? How longer is it going to take? Also, what would be the effect on the the Hezbollah, Hashd al-Sha'bi, the Houthis, and all the evil that Iran creates in the area? Thank you.
Emil, go ahead.
Thank you. We cover a lot of conflicts in the ACS, but we need to have a criteria for what we study within the publication. So we have a definition of armed conflict that explains, for instance, why Iran is not covered in the ACS. It has to do with the scale, the intensity, the time scale of a conflict. Iran may qualify next year if this unrest escalates, lasts, and then takes other forms. Yep. So at the moment, we'll have to discuss when we're back in London. Not sure the criteria we have apply to that. Now, let me answer your question. This is indeed an unprecedented uprising in Iran because of its scale, its geographical spread, because of the intensity that we see, because of the deliberate targeting that we see of state authority, because of a clear both generational gap where, in a way, if you want to simplify it, it's basically granddaughters rising up against the grandfathers, right? That you see a very large segment of the population questioning some of the choices that their grandfathers essentially made in '79 and so on, and say our orientation is different. Now, what's interesting, Iran, when you want to look at history, has had 3 revolutions in the previous century. It's a vibrant, restless society. So one shouldn't be surprised that they're always questioning state authority, the limits of free speech, etc. What's happening right now is that in 1999, you had an uprising in the universities. In 2009, you had an uprising because of the election and real allegations of fraud there. Then, but that was like really focused on the electoral contest. From 2017 to 2019, it was perhaps like mostly a socio-economic driven uprising. Now, it seems like a broad-based ideological generational thing happening. And we see the build-up, essentially. All this is, it's cumulative, essentially. It starts small and it acquires more dimensions. What's relevant for us in the rest of the region is, as you say, what does it do to how Iran spreads influence in the region? Will Iran consider that they have to fight elsewhere to protect the core of the regime, or should they bring back focus at home and so on? My colleague John Rain and I may argue that actually Iran operates in the region at a low cost, and it is strategic, so we may not necessarily see a reduction in terms of Iranians' role. The second question, which I think is key, is we see a lot of unrest in the various ethnic communities in Iran, and that, although this has happened in the past, this is actually different. The Baluchis, the Kurds, and we see the Iranian system trying to push back. So it is very relevant. It will affect Iran's power. It may not necessarily affect the strategies, the willingness to do things. But there are so many other dimensions at play here. Regional de-escalation or not, greater convergence between Iran and Russia, sense of between the two that they have a similar purpose at this point. So, I wouldn't declare the end of, the Iranian system. It still has quite a lot in it. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, lots of hands. So my colleague David Gordon, I will come to the center. We're not being totally biased towards the left, but David, do you want to go first?
Thank you very, very much. My question is to Nigel. Could you give a sort of net assessment on where the Russia-Ukraine conflict is now? General Milley spoke a couple of days ago and said that there have been roughly 100,000 casualties on each side. What's your sense of who has momentum, how far that can go? You had mentioned that you foresee this going on for a long time. Does that mean that we're sort of in a permanent balance here?
Now, I fear if Nigel gives an entire net assessment, we'll have no time for any more questions. So I'm going to take a few more, and then we'll pick a few. So the gentleman here, I saw your hand shoot up. Maybe you can wait for the microphone if you don't mind.
My name's Larry Rubin. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech, but I'm also an associate fellow at IISS. This is, of course, amazing, and it's great in the classroom, too. My question is kind of for everybody, but again, inspired by what Emil said, because one of your remarks about Syria intrigued me, because what you said was, you'd said after kind of the Russian withdrawal, in a sense, of being less active in the Astana process, and Turkey has kind of elevated its role there, and made me think, and you said this may cause some type of disequilibrium, but what we've seen, I think, in Syria, if there's a decrease in casualties as measured by what stability and instability is, with Russian withdrawal at the same time, maybe as Nigel said, we've got this continuing conflict for a long period of time, maybe we will see kind of more stability in that sense. It may not mean that it's going to lead to a political process, as you said, but it's also a question of, I think, going back to Benjamin's bigger point about one of the big takeaways is more about the intervention of third-party actors all over, and maybe this is some bigger question or message that way. So it's, I mean, a couple things, and one might be also, can we see in Russian involvement, and not just in Syria, in Libya over, say, a month to 2 months at a time, of if there was kind of less casualties, because you could imagine why, and why Russia needs to dedicate more resources to a different type of conflict. So anyway, thanks for the great work as well, too.
I'm going to take 2 more questions, and then, so I see the lady there, and then Sir at the front, and then we'll
Thank you. Maria Fantapie, Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. I just wanted to pick up on the points of Mr. Gold-Davis and Emil and Mr. Petrini as well. So on the one hand, we see a West that is united when it comes to the war in Ukraine, but also we see more and more rotting conflict in the region. So I would like just to challenge the issue of the Western unity vis-à-vis of the world developments, because while we see a lot of unity when it comes to Ukraine, are we really going to see unity when it comes to rotting conflict in the region, when it comes to energy crisis and how to deal with that? From a European perspective, being a former European diplomat, I can see an increasing Europe of nations rather than a multilateralism at play. And so this is very concerning, being also this region in the neighborhood of Europe. Thank you very much.
Got it. And then the gentleman right at the very front. And now my colleagues are going to give answers of the utmost brevity to get us to the close. Sir.
Well, thank you very much for a very informative session and data collection. And what I saw, the future is, the data perhaps pointing looks very bleak and some sort of very depressing, to be honest. Did you find sniffing through your data that there are some commonality if the world they hone all their effort, consolidated effort on that we will have a brighter future?
That's an excellent point. Now, here's how we're going to do this. Nigel's going to give us 1 minute on Ukraine. Emil's going to answer the question on Syria. Benjamin's going to give us the question on Western unity. And then Irena's going to give us 1 minute on things to be optimistic for. Nigel.
Yeah, and that assessment, well, how long do you have? Well, we have been
1 minute.
1 minute.
Is how long you have.
The clock is ticking. Okay, I have 3 or 4 points here very, very quickly then. The first is that, well, I'm of the view that the war itself Russia's invasion was not a surprise, but much else that has followed has been a surprise. It's been extremely hard to predict, even 2 or 3 months ahead, the dynamic of this war. We've been through at least 3 or 4 narratives. Every time you think you know sort of where it's at, reality has disrupted that. So it's, in a sense, it's a way of not answering a question, but a high degree of uncertainty. But nonetheless, I'd say at this point, in many respects, on the battlefield, Ukraine's position relative to Russia has never been stronger in terms of morale, motivation, troop quality and experience, equipment and supply, generalship, political leadership. They're all stronger. And Russia knows that. And yet, on the home front, Ukraine's home front, of course, is now suffering escalating damage. And this is very deliberate. So it's, and Ukraine also remains actually quite fundamentally dependent on Western support. And it takes us into the important question of the future of the West cohesion and its resolve in supporting Ukraine. There are growing concerns about the quite specific, the variable but very important, about ammunition stocks and supply. Watch that, I would say. How much the West feels, in the short term at least, the run rates it can still continue to supply Ukraine. So on Western unity more broadly, yes, watch the winter. Putin certainly is. He still thinks that the West sooner or later will crumble or compromise. I'm still impressed, as I say, by, if one looks at deeds and not as occasionally wobbly words, the direction of travel of the West has been escalatory, actually, both in the quality and quantity of what it's supplied to Ukraine militarily, but also in now 8 EU sanctions packages. Who would have thought? I don't see any major political party or movement anywhere in the West beginning to make the argument that we have to trade off these different considerations, support for Ukraine on the one hand, with responding to the costs to our citizens at home in a different way, order those priorities differently from what the way that the public policy is ordering them now. But let's see where we are in the spring.
Thank you, Nigel. Emil.
Thank you. It's interesting to examine the question of whether Russia has to rethink its position in the region. I would say, look, in Syria, it was essentially managing the battlefield. It was managing the regional competition for many years now. But it's a bit tired of that. It wants to maintain its position. It certainly values the military airport it has, the seaport. It still wants to be present, but does it want to be, guaranteeing, deals like the 2018 one in southern Syria? Does it want to, which, by the way, wasn't properly implemented and actually is leading to a breakdown in that region? Does it want to challenge Turkey at a time where it needs Turkey for other reasons? And so I think strategically, the Russians, whether it's in Libya or Syria and so on, will maintain their position because this is how you outflank your rivals in the West, essentially. It's not about dominating anymore. It's not about necessarily shaping the future of these places. It's really about nagging, keeping off balance, having a position, just making sure that Western countries have to just watch their back while they're challenging them on the main front line in Ukraine. Now the question is how the rest of the region fills that vacuum, whether they ask Russia to be present, make it because they need it, or they basically try to fill that void, greater competition perhaps between Iran and Turkey in Syria. Will the Gulf states, for instance, which relied quite considerably on Russian goodwill in some places, essentially write off this partner because it cannot do power projection the way it was hoped it would? So I think we're not necessarily at a pivot point, but Russia is no longer, I would argue, this central military actor that some thought it was at a certain point.
Very good. Benjamin, what about Western unity?
On the question on Western cohesion, I think we have to think about the Western cohesion on Ukraine as a bit of an outlier. And that the Western positions and divisions in a continent like Sub-Saharan Africa has not dramatically changed. I mean, the West moves together with sort of concerted approaches on security, on development, on humanitarian issues. It comes together when it has to renew peacekeeping operations, for example, or having assistance to providing assistance to Somalia, or pulling out all from Mali when Russia comes in. I think that there are no signs of sort of a renewed multilateralism from Western actors in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I see more as forward-looking, as empowering and giving more agency to the African Union and to the regional economic communities, for example. So I see there an element where conflicts can be better managed.
Now we're right up against time, so Irena, give us one thing to be optimistic for the gentleman in the front, and then we'll move to a close.
Great. So I'll try to be positive. I think in general we do. You'll see in the report actually we do have a section for each conflict, for each region on a glimmer of hope, let's say. But personally, I think what is quite encouraging is the fact that there is an increasing awareness on the role that climate crisis is having on conflict as an exacerbator of root causes, and I think there is also an increased momentum on the need of really mitigate those impact. And I think if really there is a fairer way to address mitigation also between, obviously developing countries and developed countries, I think that's going to really help mitigate, but also is going to put the countries which are in fragile countries more exposed to climate change in a much stronger position. And I think it will change a bit the equilibrium as well. But of course, there are lots of internal and domestic issues to address. But I do think that, and I encourage you to read the report because there is quite a lot of positive as well, not just negatives.
All right. Thank you very much, Irena. A sort of bright note on which to end on. Thank you very much to my colleagues and to everyone else from around the Institute. This is really a labor of many hands, the Armed Conflict Survey. It's an excellent read, so thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Thank you.
you.